Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Tippie College's webinar on negotiation skills, strategies for success. My name is Barb Thomas and I will be coordinating today's webinar. Now, before I tell you about an upcoming webinar that we have scheduled, we're going to put up a slide that we want you to review. As we go into our session on negotiations, we want you to think about a time when you had to negotiate. So as your brain ponders that, I do want to let you know that on Wednesday, April 16th, we have our final webinar in the Entrepreneurial Webinar Series. This webinar will focus on launching and growing your startup. Our panel of experienced entrepreneurs will share their experiences and advice, so look in the chat for a registration link. Now, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Tippie College's Alumni Resources page and our YouTube channel. Now, we will have time for questions at the end of our discussion, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. If you'd like to tell us where you're attending from in the chat, please feel free to add that as well. Now, today our speaker is Jennifer Nahrgang, a professor and the Department Executive Officer in the Tippie College's Department of Management and Entrepreneurship. In addition, she holds a Henry B. Tippie Excellence Chair. Her work focuses on leadership processes and leadership development, team dynamics and effectiveness, employee voice and engagement, and the future of work. She has published numerous articles in top-tier management journals, and her research has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and CNBC. And with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer. Jen?
Thanks, Barb, and welcome everyone. I saw that we've got some people from Iowa, but then people from California, one from Kenya. So that's great that we have such a great representation. So again, as Barb mentioned, as we go into this, I just want you to think about a time when you negotiated something important, how you prepared, maybe what the outcome was, and then is there anything you would do differently? And then we'll return to these questions at the end to see kind of what you took away from the webinar as well. So when you think about negotiation, what is a negotiation? So we probably think about a typical negotiation like buying and selling a car or buying and selling a house. Many people brought up questions around job offers and job negotiations, which we'll talk about in today's webinar. And some of you even said, well, how do I negotiate with my kids? That's often a question that comes up is how do I get them to eat what's on their plate or negotiate their bedtime with them? So, negotiation is ubiquitous throughout life. And the typical definition that we think of, kind of two definitions here, is just this interactive process where someone essentially wants something from us. And they want something, and we want something in return. It also could be thought of as this back and forth negotiation or communication process where we're trying to reach agreement when perhaps some of our interests are shared and some of them are opposed. And so, again, there's some different terms in there like interests and things like that we're going to define a little bit more clearly as we go through this negotiation webinar. But I think what, often what we think about is when we're trying to negotiate is we're trying to get to that win-win. Or if for those of you that are Office fans, what Michael Scott would have said was a win-win-win situation. So what does that mean in terms of effective negotiations? So, again, a lot of times at the individual level, we think about it as, have I gotten some valued resources, whether that's money, that's a project, maybe that's other resources like people to help me with those projects. But I think we also have to remember that in negotiations, you're also building and maintaining relationships. You are, to a certain extent, you're enhancing your reputation, hopefully, but certainly there's reputation effects, and you're gaining people's trust in you as well. So there certainly is this interpersonal component to negotiations, and we'll talk about when that's more important than others. But it's not just about this valued resources. At the organizational level, again, we think about it as this profitable deal making, mergers and acquisitions, those types of things, maybe a deal that we're doing with a supplier or a client. But again, we also are thinking about things like what's some positive press that we can achieve out of this? Can we also enhance the reputation of the company or perhaps help build our brand? So what we're going to talk about today are kind of three main questions that I think are really key in terms of strategies for success in negotiations. The first is, how do I prepare for the negotiation? And I will say, as you think about negotiations, a lot of people think about it as, in the one-time event when I'm negotiating and exchanging information with the other person in the negotiation. But most of it starts way before that in the preparation phase. And so preparation is really key to negotiation. And some of the best negotiators, that's really where they spend most of their time. So we're going to talk a lot about how do we prepare for the negotiation. Part of that is also this second question in terms of how do I understand these issues and interests of the other party? And again, we'll define those terms and break those down. And then finally, how do I approach the negotiation in terms of maybe opening offers and things like that? So first, let's start in terms of thinking about preparation for a negotiation. You really have to consider, what type of negotiation am I in? So one would be a distributive negotiation. That's a zero-sum kind of win-lose game. And the best analogy is thinking about, I'm trying to get the biggest slice of pie. So there's a pie that we're trying to divide up between the two of us, or maybe the three of us, and I want the biggest slice. Examples of this are the market transactions, buying and selling a car, buying and selling a house, any type of where maybe the relationship is not as important in a distributive negotiation. Maybe it's a one-time event, and we won't be back in negotiations with that individual. And so we can take the biggest slice of the pie. The second negotiation or major type of negotiation is an integrative negotiation. Again, that's the win-win scenario where we're not just wanting to slice the pie, but we actually want to expand the pie. And so again, most of this is probably what we do in everyday life because it's in business partnerships, it's in job negotiations, it's with our family and our friends. And so I would, after teaching this to executives and MBA students and even undergrads, I would say we often default to integrative negotiations, which is good because we're taking into account those relational aspects of a negotiation. But I would also just encourage you to think about, when are there times when we're going to be in a distributive negotiation? So in those market transactions, that's the time when you are making the big ask and going for the biggest slice of the pie. And I think sometimes we shy away from that because we default to thinking about integrative negotiations. So again, just really important to think about, which negotiation am I in? So the second thing to prepare are just to understand some foundational concepts and how they apply to your negotiation. So you've probably heard the term BATNA in a lot of different scenarios, and it basically stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It is essentially, what are you going to do if you do not make a deal? So it's not the options that I have available in this negotiation. It's, if I don't make this deal or I don't negotiate this agreement, what's my alternative? And we'll give some examples here in a minute. But that's really important to think about. It's determined by what's available. What are your available alternatives? It gives you a key source of power. It is a key source of leverage in any negotiation. The stronger your BATNA, the more ability you have to walk away and have the other person kind of meet your conditions. So important to think about kind of, what would I do if I'm not going to make this agreement? The second key concept is a reservation point, sometimes also called the walk away point. It's basically, depending on which side of the negotiation you're in, what's the highest or lowest value that I'm willing to give or receive. It may or may not be the same as BATNA, and I'll give an example here in a minute of when that might be the case. And then what's important to think about is, a lot of people think about their own BATNA, their own walk away point. But the key to negotiation and preparation is to also think about that for the other party. Because what that does is it sets up what you've probably heard term ZOPA, or the zone of possible agreement, which is basically that distance between our walkaway points. And so it's really important for you to think about, well, how much information do I have? Not just about my own situation, but about the other party. So let's give a good example here in terms of how we can apply these foundational concepts. And I'm going to use the example of a car sale. I just went to the Chicago Auto Show in February. And so I think the market value now, although there were certainly cars there, are much higher than that. But let's just assume that we're buying a car with a market value of around $36,000 to $42,000. And so we know that that's kind of the set value. Maybe that came from the Blue Book value. Maybe that just came from research that's out there. But that's the market value of the car. And so if I'm the buyer and I'm thinking about buying this car, what would be my BATNA? What would be my walkaway? What would be my goal? So one way to think about this is, a buyer, to a certain extent, if I don't buy this car, then I've got to find another car to buy. That's what your BATNA is. It's not, I'm going to buy, these options versus the other options on a car. I want the red car versus the blue car. It's actually, if I don't make an agreement on this particular car, then I'm going to have to find another car to buy. My walkaway point could be set by a lot of different things. In this example, I've just set it at $40,000 because that's how much loan you've been approved for. So that's really your walkaway. You can't go above that, otherwise you got to bring in cash. And so that's your walkaway point. And then in terms of a goal, again, you've got to set a goal for what you want to buy this car for. And so perhaps a reasonable goal for this is $36,000, that you want to be at the lower end of that market value. And so that sets up a range there for the buyer. For the seller, again, this is perhaps not maybe in a car dealership, but an individual selling the car. Their BATNA could be that they have another buyer that's willing to pay $39,000. So again, they have a pretty good BATNA because that is within the market value of this car. And so you would say they have some leverage here in terms of their negotiation leverage. So some power here on the seller side. They're willing to walk away at $38,000. So you might say, when I said the walkaway point could be the same as BATNA, could not be. In this case, I've set it up to say they're willing to walk away at $38,000. So if the buyer says, I will pay $38,000, they're willing to say, okay, let's do that. Why is that the case? Well, maybe because they don't want to have to deal, maybe this is a cash situation. Maybe they don't want to have to do transportation with this other buyer. So I'm willing to kind of walk away at that point, but I've got to have at least that. And then their goal is $42,000. Again, they've set it at the higher end of the market value. Perhaps they've listed the sales price at $44,000. Why is that the case? Again, they're looking for potentially to try to get above that goal. So I'm going to list it at this just as kind of an opening offer is what you would consider probably that listed sales price. So I told Barb that my lights would probably go off. I got to perhaps turn them back on. There we go. Sorry about that. So this sets up those kind of foundational concepts. And what you can see from there is this sets up the ZOPA, so that zone of possible agreement. So anywhere between that $38,000 and that $40,000, we should be able to make a deal. And I would say for both the seller and the buyer, if you're within that range, you've done well. Now, there are cases that are much more complicated than this, that you may actually, once you sit down and think about these numbers, that you actually have a negative ZOPA in terms of the seller is much higher than what the buyer is willing to do. And so that's a really hard negotiation to get to. So to get an agreement on. So you really have to think about what your ZOPA is. And so again, as you prepare your strategy, one of the things that we give our students in the classroom, anytime they're going into a negotiation in the classroom, is we basically make them prepare. And the first thing we ask them is, what problem are you trying to solve? So I'm trying to solve the problem of I need a car, right? In that example. But you really need to think about what's the problem you're trying to solve. And then, as we talked about, really important for you to think about not just for yourself, what's your BATNA, what's your reservation point, what's your goal, but if you can, do some research to think about the other party and estimate for them what's their BATNA, what's their reservation point, what's their goal. This is probably the hardest part for students. It's the hardest part in reality, is because you think, well, how would I know that, right? But you could know that from the market value, right? In terms of thinking about, well, the other party probably is not going to walk away for this for less than market value. Maybe their BATNA is they do have another buyer. That's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is they don't have another buyer. And then what would be their goal? Again, probably to be at the top of the market, right? So you don't know those for certain, but certainly it's important as you prepare to think about what those could be. That also helps you to ask questions in the negotiation to really get to an understanding of where the other party is on those same three things: BATNA, reservation point, and goal. So before we wrap up this piece kind of strategy and the preparation, again, in terms of effective goals in negotiation, so you saw different goals in that car sale negotiation. You know, goals in negotiation are very similar to what you've probably heard in terms of SMART goals. They need to be specific. They need to be realistic, those type of things. But what's important to think about when you're setting effective goals in a negotiation is understand what is it that you really want. So it may not be price. We're going to talk about job negotiations. Again, so your goal in a job negotiation a lot of times is a salary, but maybe it's vacation time. Maybe it's flexibility. And so you need to think about what are those goals in the negotiation that you really want. Set something optimistic. We'll talk about that here towards the end in terms of how optimistic can you be in different scenarios. But it is important that they're justifiable, that there's a target there that people could point to and say, yeah, that seems reasonable. That's within market value. Or maybe it's a little bit above market value because I understand this. Be specific. Again, commitment to those goals matter. And then don't, carry your goal into the negotiation with you. So be sure that you've kind of thought about that and you're carrying it forward into the negotiation. It's not just an exercise of futility, but that it's actually something that you can go back to and think about, and maybe take a pause in the negotiation to remind yourself, what was my goal as I came into this negotiation? So the second question that we really need to think about is, how do I understand the issues and the interest of the other party? And the best way to think about issues and interest are that issues are really what's on top of the iceberg. You've got the iceberg, it's what you can see. So it's the what of the negotiation. What do I want? What do they want? Really something very concrete, something that we've decided on. It's the things like price, the color of the car, different things like that. In a job negotiation, it may be vacation, all those types of things. So what is it that we want? What are the issues that we're going to negotiate on? But more importantly, in a negotiation is you need to think about, why are these important to me, right? And that's really getting underneath the iceberg, underneath the water, I guess, to the bottom of the iceberg, to think about why is it that I want this? Why is it that maybe they want that? What caused you to decide? What are your motivations, your values, that makes me think that this is the position that I'm going to take on this negotiation? So again, think of it as an iceberg. It's really easy to identify the what in negotiations. We need to get to the why. And so let me give you some examples. The most classic example, if you were to Google issues and interest in negotiations, is the example of an orange, where two people are fighting over an orange. And so clearly a possible solution is we're just going to cut the orange in half, right? You get one half, I get the other. But and so that would be the position that we're going to take. I need this orange. And so potentially we could come to the solution that we're just going to cut it in half. But if we start digging into, well, why does someone need this orange? Why do I need this orange? Why do they need this orange? We come to understand that one of us needs the peel for zesting, for baking. and the other of us needs the juice. And then we come to that win-win solution where we could understand, we could actually use this one orange and both get what we want. And so rather than just cutting the orange in half, let's both get what we want and both our interests are satisfied. So that's why it's important to get to those underlying interests. Let me give you some probably more practical examples. So one of them may be you're selling software, you're a software salesperson, you've got a client that you've been working with, and you basically have said to them, the price of this software as well as maintenance is $100,000. And the client comes back and says, I can only pay $75,000. And so again, the issue here is price. You may also think, well, is the issue value? Do they not see the value in the software, in the maintenance that we're going to give in this? But when you start asking questions and you start understanding from the client, you understand that $75,000 is all they have left in their budget for this year. And so it's not about the price. It's not about the value of the product. It's just they've got constraints that make it to such that they can only pay $75,000. So again, perhaps the solution here is to sell a 2-year contract where $75,000 of it comes out of this year's budget, $25,000 could come out of next year's budget. So because you've thought about those underlying interests and you've uncovered them in a negotiation, then you can think about different ways that we can satisfy that. Another example would be you're negotiating a new project. And so one of the issues is the deadline, right? And so the client's saying, we need it by this deadline. The freelancer is saying, I can't do it by this deadline. I need 2 more weeks or another month. And so again, we can walk into that negotiation and we can think, if we're the client, well, are we not that important of a client? They're not willing to meet our deadline, right? As we start talking and we start thinking about it, even before we start thinking about, well, why would they have that interest? We understand that as the client, we need it to complete our marketing campaign. So we need the material that we've contracted for them so we can meet our marketing campaign. The freelancer, their underlying interest is, I just want to deliver a high quality project. And because of, that short deadline, I don't feel like I'm going to be able to meet that full and complete everything up to the quality that I would expect. So again, a solution may be extend the deadline, but it may be more of if we can understand those underlying interests, then maybe we can work together to understand, could we do some phased delivery? Could we do some additional resources? What are some things that we could do to where the freelancer feels like I'm delivering a high quality project and the client is getting the information they need to be able to move forward in their marketing campaign? So those are underlying issues and interests. Again, as we think about one of the things that we do as students is to think about what are the issues that are most important. Is we really, before they go into a negotiation, is to think about, well, what issues are the most important and why are they important? So setting up, again, a table like this to think about for yourself, what do you want? What are those specific issues that are important to you? And then more importantly, why do I want this? What problem am I trying to solve? And then again, I think you have to think about that for the other party. What do they want? Why do they want this? What problem are they trying to solve? And so, a lot of that comes in that preparation phase. It's important to just kind of think about those things to get some perspective and think about their perspective before you enter a negotiation, particularly in an integrated negotiation. But if that's, you're not going to have all the answers. And so that's where, as you go into the negotiation, you're really trying to ask some good questions to understand, why is that important? What problem are you trying to solve? And then out of that, we can think about, well, what would be some options that might satisfy both of our interests? And so how can we kind of multiply the alternatives and think about, well, what's really important to them is this. What's important to me is this. And is there a way that we can come to an agreement that both of us are satisfied? So, one of the books of negotiation talks about this in terms of just really thinking about it. And I would say, I use this slide not just in negotiations, but anytime you're thinking about in leading or trying to influence people, maybe it's a team decision making. is just to remember that the most influential discussions are not about what you want, what your interests are, but they're about the other side's interests and understanding those. And if you can understand kind of their interests, then hopefully you can get to a position on different issues that will satisfy those interests. And that's going to make the negotiation much more successful. So the last piece then is, well, how do I approach the negotiation? So we've talked about preparation. Again, the BATNA, the reservation point, what's our goal? As we go into the negotiation, we need to understand the issues and the interest, and in that information exchange portion of the negotiation, we need to try to get to those if we haven't quite figured them out. But then we need to think about, well, how will I approach it? So again, we go back to those integrative and distributive negotiations. And so I'll start here on the top row with an integrative negotiation. The strategy for an integrative negotiation, again, these are negotiations where we're trying to expand the pie. We're trying to find that win-win. So we're really taking a problem-solving approach. We may take compromise. Again, the best win-win would look for how do we expand the pie. Compromise, we often think is like that's the best way to solve a negotiation. It's actually not in an integrative negotiation, because we're not trying to expand the pie in a compromise. But a problem-solving approach really says, how can we solve this problem where we're both satisfied? And that would say that we've expanded the pie. The worst, I would say, is just avoiding negotiating. An integrated negotiation is probably the worst strategy that you can take. In terms of the opening offer, so how do I, make an opening offer? Should I make an opening offer? When should I do so? So in an integrative negotiation, I think if you're in doubt about what's a good opening offer, then probably not. If you have good information, then yes. An integrative negotiation is also one where you want to be fair, right? It can't be so outlandish or way too optimistic that people will think, why would they ever negotiate this? Again, the relationship in an integrative negotiation, just as important. And so it needs to be a fair opening offer. And then as you go through the negotiation, what are you going to do? Well, in terms of concessions, as we're going back and forth on different things in an integrative negotiation, probably avoid haggling. So going back and forth, nitpicking, small things. Again, the relationship is just as important here as the ultimate outcome in an integrative negotiation. You want to make big moves on little issues. We'll talk about that in terms of kind of in a job negotiation, and little moves on big issues. So again, that's why it's important when you prepare to think about what issues are most important to you and why. And then again, in an integrative negotiation, we're building trust, we're building reputation, we're maintaining our relationship with this person. So we do need to reciprocate. If they concede something to us, an issue to us, and say, okay, I can give you that, then it is also helpful to kind of trade on those issues or reciprocate those. In terms of a distributive negotiation, again, we're in a market transaction here, right? And so this is the time when you can be competitive. You could also take a problem-solving approach to say, okay, what do you need? What do I need? Let's problem solve this. Could also take a compromise. I would say the worst here, other than avoidance, is just to accommodate, meaning you're going to give in to the other party. And so in a distributive negotiation, again, car sales, those type of things, you don't want to necessarily, you can be more competitive. So you don't just need to accommodate everything, which may mean that you need to walk out again, or walk away from that negotiation. In terms of opening offers in a distributive negotiation, if you have good information, you absolutely should make a first offer. There is a big anchoring effect. First offers, they will anchor a negotiation. So if you're, negotiating over price, the first offer that gets put out there usually anchors it, and then it moves from there. So that's important to think about. Pretty strong effect there. So important to think about, having an open offer that's optimistic, but not, again, so outlandish that they would stop negotiating. In some cases, you could probably do that and just see if it works. Most cases, it won't. But that you can be more optimistic in a distributive negotiation. In terms of concessions, again, here you're really looking at ultimately my goal in the negotiation is to win. And my win comes at, the expense of the other person. So be firm, be willing to walk away. And because you've set those goals and you're saying, that's not what I want to pay for this, or that's not what I want to sell this for. Be willing to walk away. And then again, concede in slowly in diminishing amounts toward that expected level. So you don't want to concede too quickly. And in most cases, in a distributive negotiation, you're not really trading issues per se. You can hold firm as you negotiate throughout. So again, those are the key things to think about in terms of how do I prepare for the negotiation? How do I understand those issues and interests of the other party? And then finally, how do I approach it? So thing that I want you to think about as I think a lot of you were interested in was, well, let's consider some job negotiations. So I'm in a job negotiation. What does this mean for me? So the first is to think about what are some potential BATNAs here. So again, if you're the candidate that has the job offer, what's your potential BATNA? Your potential BATNA is you either have a job, which is good, right? That's a pretty strong BATNA. Or maybe if you're brand new out into the workforce, if you don't have another offer, then your BATNA is essentially, I've got to look for another job. If I don't make an agreement with this recruiter or on this job, then I've got to continue to look for something else. And so again, that's a weaker BATNA if you're in the candidate position. What is a BATNA on the recruiter side or on the company side? Again, they may have other candidates, right? And so they can always turn to another candidate. In some cases, though, you may be in a position where you're the only candidate. You've got this expertise that they can't find anywhere else. And again, that weakens their BATNA and increases yours. So important to think about what are some of those BATNAs. What would help you set reservation points? So some of that may be, some research on different market value, what these jobs typically pay, those types of things, for those of you that are Tippie students that may be listening in, and that would also be good where you can work with career services to think about, how do I do some of that research? But certainly you can do some research there. If you have a job and you're the candidate, then maybe your reservation point is to go into this new job, I have to at least get paid what I'm getting paid now plus 10%. Like that's what it would take to move me. I don't know what that percentage is, but that's what you need to think about in terms of what's my walk away point here? Or I have to be made whole. Like I'm not going to make this change if maybe I'm not going to get paid the same. Or again, I'm focusing on salary, but maybe it's vacation. Maybe it's flexibility. If the job's not going to give me more flexibility than what I have now, then perhaps I'm willing to walk away for that. What are some of the issues? What are some of the interests in terms of kind of what's below the iceberg? So here, again, this is a fake example, but just some things to think about. So typically in a job negotiation, you've got several different issues at play. You've got vacation time. Maybe you have a start date. You're negotiating that. You're negotiating moving expenses. You're negotiating salary. And in some cases, you might be negotiating location, right? Perhaps even today, that location may be remote versus hybrid, the type of work arrangement as well. So if you think about, we all know that those are the issues, right? But it's important for us to think about what are my interests? Why are these things important to me? And then what's the underlying interest of the other party? So if I'm the candidate, I may be, again, this is a bad example of a goal of vacation time is to say the more, the better. So I would suggest you set a goal for that. But that's my underlying interest is just the more, the better, right? Starting date, if I'm a brand new college hire, I need money or if I don't have a job right now, and have been out of work, I need money. So I want to start as soon as possible. That's kind of my underlying interest. Moving expenses, I would prefer a lump sum rather than actually being reimbursed. Maybe my salary is I'm benchmarking with friends and I just want to beat the previous year's top salary if I'm coming out as a graduate. Or in salary, maybe my interest is, again, I want to beat my current salary. And then location, maybe location's really important to me because my family lives in California and I know that this opportunity has different options for location, California being one of those. On the recruiter side, it could be different, right? In terms of their underlying interests, right? So you think about vacation time, the candidate says the more the better. But for the recruiter, they could be thinking about it as, well, the typical new employee only gets 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever that is of vacation. And if I give this person more, then I'm setting a precedent. And so, again, that may be a constraint on the recruiter that they really have to take into account the underlying interest of setting a precedent. Start date, again, the candidate says, I want to start early. From the recruiter side, they say, well, I don't have orientation available until August. So there's no training available. Doesn't really make sense for me to bring you in June. And so, or maybe they want to wait until after the start of the year, different things like that. Moving expense coverage, again, they may have to think about HR policies. Salary, again, while you may be benchmarking with friends, maybe the recruiter obviously is very much benchmarking with other candidates. And so they may have, even within an organization, there's also internal equity issues that they have to consider. And then finally, location, again, they've got locations all over the place. And in this case, they need candidates in all locations. So if I'm the candidate and I really want to live in California and the recruiter says, I don't care, I need people in all places, then that's probably a point that we can come to some agreement on. And the key here is, again, in thinking about this is a multi-issue negotiation. And you need to prioritize what's the most important to you. It may not be salary, it may be location. And so thinking about that and really trying to understand the recruiter and where their priorities are as well. Because for some of those, again, you may be able to find what's mutually beneficial for each of you, like location in this case. You could pretty quickly come to an agreement on that. But there may be others where I can do this, but I can't do that, right? And so it's kind of trading off in those negotiations. So the last thing I would just say in terms of some advice on job negotiations. So I think, again, you really have to think about understanding the other side. And the first one is, who are you negotiating with? Is it your future boss, right? So in most cases, this is an organization that you're going to join. So that relationship is important, but really important if it's your future boss, right? They're taking into account kind of how you're treating them, how trustworthy you're being in this negotiation. So that's really important. You also need to understand their constraints and where they can be flexible. So again, if we go back to this slide, they may be constrained on moving expenses. They may not be as constrained. Maybe they have a band of salary that they could give. They're constrained on start date just because I don't have any training available. So you're trying to understand that, and it's important to ask that question. What are your constraints, right? What can you tell me? Where on these 5 things can you be flexible? And where are some things kind of set in stone for you? And that may help you in negotiating that. So understand their constraints. What you should prepare for in a negotiation is really explaining why you deserve what you're requesting, right? So, again, if your BATNA is strong, that's really a positive thing. And so explain why you deserve what you're requesting. Maybe that's based on market value and some benchmarking that you've done. And so you understand that. You've got to answer those tough questions like, well, why is that important to you? As well as why would you say that you need that much vacation time, or why do you need that flexibility in your work? And then the other thing that I think is important that comes out of research is think of yourself as an agent. So there is a lot of research that will show that some people won't ask in certain situations for what they want. But if they think about asking on behalf of someone else, like I'm an agent, then they're more willing to ask for that. And so I think one of the things to think about as you go into negotiation and you consider for yourself and you think, I don't know if I want to ask that. And then you think, well, if it were, a colleague that I was negotiating on behalf of, I would absolutely ask for this. I think, again, you may need to tease that out. Maybe you're not doing that because you think it could damage a relationship. And so maybe it's not an important question to ask. But I think if it's holding back and saying, well, I'm just too embarrassed to ask, or that just seems like a stretch, then you need to think of yourself as an agent and think, if I could ask for this on behalf of someone else, why am I not asking for it for myself? So think about that as well as you prepare. And then finally, keep in mind the big picture. So consider the entire deal. So again, I've used the example of job negotiations and 5 different issues. It's not just about one of those issues, it's about all 5 of those. So consider the entire deal. The other thing that's really important to think about is how you negotiate this. So the negotiation literature is pretty clear that you should negotiate multiple issues simultaneously, not serially. And so what do I mean by that? So that basically means, and I've seen this at play several times in my career, and it has not gone well for the person that has tried to negotiate serially. If you have these 5 issues, and these are the 5 things that are important to you, important to lay them all out there at the same time and say, these are the 5 things that are important to me. So can we talk about these things? Can we give and take? What you don't want to do is say, okay, let's negotiate salary. And then you come to some agreement. And then you say, okay, now let's go to location. And let's negotiate that. Let's negotiate starting date, et cetera. Especially if you're dragging it out every day and you come back and you say, well, now let's negotiate this. That does not go well typically for the person that does that. It just leaves a bad taste in the other party's mouth in terms of just thinking like, well, maybe they didn't trust me with all this information, or man, they're really going to always be negotiating things. And so, or maybe they didn't fully understand everything that they wanted. So don't negotiate things serially, but think about them in terms of a simultaneous negotiation, because that also allows you, it's not just the reputation that you're building, but it also allows you to give and take. So, if they gave up something on salary and now you're coming back and saying, well, now I want this, they may not be able to do that. And so again, both parties walk away feeling bad because they can't come to some agreement. But if you put both of those issues on the table, perhaps we could have come to some agreement that would have been helpful for both of us. And then finally, don't underestimate the importance of likability, future relationships. Again, we think about negotiations, perhaps as these market transactions, but as we go through our everyday lives, you're always negotiating. Any project deadline, some people would say anytime you're sending an email, you're negotiating. I don't know if that's, if I would say that's the case for all my emails, but certainly there's a lot of things that you're putting out there, right? This is the issue. Here's my underlying interest, right? And we're trying to come to some agreement. And the basic case, that's negotiation, right? We've got opposing interest, or we've got different perspectives on this, and we're trying to come to some sort of agreement. So I'll just end with thinking about, again, if you can go back to thinking about a time when you negotiated something important. And so based on this webinar, hopefully you can think about, well, how would you prepare differently? How would you adjust your approach? Would you have made a different opening offer? Would you have taken more of a problem-solving approach? Maybe you would have been more aggressive. And so what would you do differently next time? You could also think about it in terms of you're getting ready for a negotiation. You've got something on the horizon in the next month. And so think about, again, back to these questions. How am I going to prepare for that negotiation? How am I going to understand those underlying issues and interests? And then finally, how will I approach the negotiation? So with that, I will wrap up my formal comments and go to questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jennifer. We have had a variety of different questions. So first off, I want to remind everybody, you can use the Q&A button. You can put things into the chat if you'd like to. First off, we did have quite a few questions about books, recommendations of books that people could read about negotiations. She's pondering, she's thinking, I can see that.
So the one that I have used in class is called Bargaining for Advantage. It may be, I don't know if there's a new edition, but you certainly can find it on Amazon, actually quite cheap. Getting to Yes is another one. There's also, by that same author, Getting Past No is also by that same author. Both of those are good negotiation books. Our own Chris Voss, which is in Iowa, he's in terms of he grew up in Iowa, he's a negotiator, like high stakes negotiator, like hostage negotiator. He came a couple of years ago, right, Barb? I can't remember the name of his book, but that would be another one that I would suggest.
Great, thank you so much. So a lot of what you talked about has to do with preparation. Now, if you are a manager, you may not always have that preparation. Say someone comes into your office and they're ready to ask for that new, and salary increase, etc. Do you have any tips for what people can do when they, let's say, suddenly find themselves in a negotiation? Are there things that they can say to provide, kind of that pause, the opportunity to prepare? Any tips or tricks for that?
Sure. So I think it's in the Getting to Yes by Yuri. He actually talks about the idea of go to the balcony, and that's in the middle of a negotiation in terms of feel free to kind of take a pause, go to the balcony, think about the big picture, right? I think it could also apply prior to a negotiation. I think we feel rushed. So and some of it, and I am a person who I'm ready to go, right? I don't like to wait. I don't necessarily like to be, I am methodical, but there are certainly some people that probably want to think about all the different aspects. And so I get the understanding of feeling rushed or feeling like this has got to happen now. But if I'm a manager, I think part of it is really just stopping and asking the questions of, okay, that this is helpful. Can you give me some of the reasons why this is important to you? Can you, and even ask, like, what's your deadline for this? I'm not prepared to react to this right now, but I do want to have this discussion in the future. So can you tell me what that timeline is? And so, again, I think that's important. You want to show, obviously, a positive, like, we're willing to work with you on this, right? We're willing to talk about this issue. You don't want to dismiss it. But I do think it's okay to say, I'm willing to work with you on this. Let's sit down and talk about this. And here's what would be helpful for me to understand from your perspective.
Great. Thank you so much. So some people have helped us out with the Chris Voss book. It is Never Split the Difference.
Right.
And you're right. He was a very interesting speaker, came as a part of the UI lecture committee. Let's see, someone also added that they recently read Crucial Conversations, which has some overlap with some of that advice as well. Let's see, there was a question in the chat about, let's see, I'm going to go to one of the questions. When in a salary negotiation, how do you gauge the realistic range when seeking a position with a higher salary level? Or how do you even find that salary level? Like some companies, public companies, might have that information listed, but some may not.
Yeah, I feel like there's some information out there. I don't know if it's on Indeed and things like that, where some websites where maybe you could get an idea. Some of it is also understanding, maybe even talking to people of those, within those jobs. And then also just considering for yourself, again, I'm going to take on this much more responsibility. And so what's that worth to me in terms of salary?
Okay. So there's a question here about women negotiating, and that women sometimes don't want to negotiate for themselves, sometimes kind of lower their expectations or their asks. Do you have any specific advice for how women can be more successful in negotiations?
So the research that I talked about thinking about yourself as an agent comes out of studying the differences in men and women. I mean, even in terms of applying for a job, sometimes women will not apply for a job unless they meet all 10 criteria, versus others, men may say, oh, if I meet 7, then I'm okay. I can't remember the actual numbers. So I think for women, there is research in the past that has shown women don't ask. That research, thankfully, is actually showing that difference is uh, becoming smaller. And I think the main research there would say that if you're willing as a female and you think, I would do this for my student or for my son or for my daughter, whatever that, my peer, I would ask for this, then you should ask for it yourself. And that's where, again, the research would show if you could put women in that mindset, then certainly in terms of thinking about it for someone else, then they're more likely to ask.
Great. Now, we do have another great suggestion in the chat, and I'm just going to say, I love it when our audience participates in the chat and provides all types of helpful information. So don't ignore it, people. Go out there and look. One, that Chris Voss has a new book called Empathy and Understanding in Business. But the idea that if you are trying to find different information on salaries by region, company, size, role, ask AI. So think about it. You might be able to get a lot of information literally at your fingertips. Another recommendation from the chat is Glassdoor.com has crowdsourced salary information specific to roles without the companies. So lots of great information here. Another question from the Q&A. When is it a good time to renegotiate without signaling dissatisfaction to an organization, especially when waiting is not yielding anything? Or is it wanting is not yielding? But how do you renegotiate, say, with a current company, you're happy with your employer, but you feel that you should be paid more?
Again, I think that's where you have to be willing to answer those tough questions. And some of that is, well, why would you say that you need to be paid more? That's going to the research to saying, well, there are other people doing the same job and getting paid this. And although I'm happy with this, I do think I bring this value, this value, this value. You can also frame it as, here's the loss that would occur, not just in losing me, but in terms of the expertise that I bring that will maybe not occur if I don't stay with the company. I think in most cases, again, I think in most cases, employers want to respond positively to those things. I'll take the positive view that I do think employers, for a valued employee, will want to respond to those. They may not be able to get you as much as you want. But if it's been a while, I think that's important to put that ask out there. Again, that's where it goes into, if you did it every year, they're probably not going to respond well, right? And so, although I certainly have had MBA students that said they ask for it every year, but raise every year. But I think if you're going to ask for it every year, that's probably not going to be as successful. But if it's been a while and you can show the market has moved to this and this is your value to the company, I would certainly put that ask out there.
How about advice on how to practice your negotiations? So we prepared, we've looked at a lot of information. What are the best ways that you can practice so that you're not so nervous when you go into that negotiation?
Yeah. So, to me, I think one of the scariest things about negotiation is just putting the ask out there. And so that may be as simple as calling your cable company and asking for a reduction, right? Or a different plan. Like maybe you just go out there and negotiate with someone that you don't know and just put an ask out there because you're afraid of putting an ask, right? Like that's an example of where if you're afraid of putting the ask out there, go to someone, go to a flea market and say, oh, you're selling this for $10. Will you take 8? Right. And just get used to and comfortable with asking. And so that's one of them. The second is, I think, role playing with peers and colleagues is good practice. Someone also just put that in the chat. And then I would also say there's probably some AI tools out there. Even PowerPoint apparently will, it has some AI capabilities. That's more in a presentation mode. But my guess is there's some AI capabilities out there of different things where I know you can certainly negotiate with bots, but thinking about AI capabilities and how I would frame this would be also ways of preparing, and then just role playing it and practicing.
Exactly. And I'd love to remind people that if you're an alum of the University of Iowa, you do have access to a program called Big Interview, which is operated from the Pomerantz Career Center. And so alumni can access that. And it's basically an AI type of tool where you can simulate an interview and you can be asked questions. My guess is that it might also help with negotiations as well. I'm going to go for one last question. What are some best practices or advice when expressing vulnerability during a negotiation?
That's a good question. I do think some best practices. I think one of the things that we think about with negotiation is that we have to have all the answers. And so I think the vulnerability of, I don't know the answer to that piece, or I don't have the data on this. And so I'd be open to thinking about this in a different way with you as we're negotiating. I think being that does build trust in terms of just being open as well about what are your interests. So maybe, your underlying interests make you feel vulnerable. But again, I think if people can understand why you're motivated for job flexibility or why vacation, I think somebody put this in the chat, it's for your family, right? Being vulnerable about that will aid you in that negotiation and build trust as well.
Excellent. Oh, and look, Gina has just put a link into the chat about Big Interview. Okay, if you're interested in that, this is your opportunity. Go out there, click on that link before the end of the webinar so that you can see what it's all about. And in addition, Kim, who is the head librarian at the Pomerantz Business Library within the Tippie College of Business, has also stated that the business librarians at Tippie are happy to direct people to sources that provide salary and wage data. Gosh, isn't everyone at the Tippie College just so helpful? It's amazing. Yeah. Well, Jennifer, I really want to thank you for sharing all of this information with us today. Given the high registration numbers for this and the high attendance, we know that this is a topic that many people are greatly interested in, and you have given people a lot of food for thought. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I do want to remind everyone this has been recorded, and in a few days, we will send everyone who registered a link to this recording so that you can watch it again or share it with others. In addition, immediately after this webinar, there will be a short survey that will pop up in your browser. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take a few moments to share your feedback and to help us enhance our future programs. So with that, on behalf of the Tippie College of Business, our amazing speaker, Jennifer Nahrgang, we want to thank you for joining us today. And as always, go Hawks. Bye, everyone.